Good morning, boys and girls. Miss Kusama here. Can you believe they were already on week 6 of our distance learning? Oh my gosh, it's been so long since we've seen each other all together in the classroom and in the halls and in the cafeteria. I miss you all so much, and we all hope that you guys are doing well. So for this week, week 6, we're going to get into partitioning. Does anyone know what partitioning means? Think about the base word in the word partition. Do you guys see that? The word part. So what do you think partition means? I'm sure you guys had some good guesses. Okay, so the word partition means to divide or to separate. So that's what we'll be doing. We'll be using our partitioning skills this week to divide rectangles into same size squares. And we have a couple of ways that we can do that. I have several videos for you guys. We have the first one, partitioning rectangles into same size squares by creating rows and columns. We all remember rows and columns from when we did arrays. We have, again, partitioning a rectangle into just columns. We have finding the number of same size squares in a rectangle. And lastly, partitioning rectangles using the same size squares. So I'm going to start with the first video, partitioning rectangles into same size squares by creating rows and columns. And I'm going to start with this one because we're all familiar with rows and columns and repeated addition sentences with our arrays. So I'm going to start here. Make sure you're listening.
How can you partition this rectangle into same-sized squares? In this lesson, you will learn how to partition a rectangle into same-sized squares by creating columns and rows. Partition means to separate something into sections. Here I have a rectangle. I can draw lines through this rectangle to partition it into sections. Today, we are going to use columns to partition a rectangle, and we're going to create rows. We need to remember that columns go down. Here I have 3 boxes of popcorn that form one column. Columns go down. This rectangle has been partitioned into 3 columns. We need to also remember that rows go across. Here I have 3 boxes of popcorn in a row. This rectangle has 2 rows. All of this popcorn has got me thinking about the movies. And at the movies, seats are arranged into rows. Partition this rectangle into 3 rows and 2 columns. We remember that rows go across, so we will draw a horizontal line and another horizontal line. We notice that by drawing 2 horizontal lines, we have created 3 rows. We will now create 2 columns. We will draw 1 vertical line. Vertical lines go up and down. We notice that we have 2 columns. We notice that in the first row, we have 2 squares. In the second row, we have 2 squares. In the third row, we have 2 squares as well. Oh, I know. I can count the squares, or I can add 2 plus 2 plus 2.
And remember, boys and girls, that this 2 plus 2 plus 2 is called repeated addition. The same number is repeated.
And I find the answer is 6. 6 squares. Partition this rectangle into 2 rows and 5 columns. I remember that rows go across. I draw one horizontal line and I notice that I have created 2 rows. Now I will partition my rectangle into 5 columns. I remember that columns go up and down, so I will draw lines that are vertical. I draw 1 line, 2 lines, 3 lines, 4 lines. After drawing 4 lines, I notice that I have created 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. Now I can count my squares. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 squares in the first row. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 squares in the second row. I can add 5 plus 5, and that gives me 10. 10 same-sized squares. This rectangle has been partitioned into 10 same-sized squares, and I did that by creating columns and rows. Partition this rectangle into 3 rows and 4 columns. I remember that rows go across. I draw one horizontal line, another horizontal line. That gives me 3 rows. Now I need to create 4 columns. Columns go up and down. I draw a vertical line in the middle, another vertical line, another vertical line. This gives me 1, 2, 3, 4. I will count how many squares are in each row. 1, 2, 3, 4. The next row, 1, 2, 3, 4. And the last row, 1, 2, 3, 4. I can add these 3 numbers. 4 plus 4 plus 4 gives me 12. I have partitioned this rectangle into 12 same-sized squares by creating columns and rows. In this lesson, you have learned how to partition a rectangle into same-sized squares by creating columns and rows.
Okay, boys and girls, you notice that when she was partitioning the rectangles, she kept saying into same size squares. So that means your squares cannot be big and some are small. They must be the same size, which means they're equal. So let's look at a video that helps us partition rectangles using the same size squares. So we're going to learn how to make our squares the same size.
How many same-sized squares can cover this rectangle? In this lesson, you will learn how to partition a rectangle by using same-sized squares. A quadrilateral is a shape with 4 sides. We're going to take a look at 2 specific quadrilaterals. Let's take a look at a rectangle. A rectangle has 4 square corners. It has 4 sides. Opposite sides are the same length. The top and the bottom are the same length, and the end sides are the same length. Let's take a look at a square. A square has 4 square corners. It has 4 sides. All sides are the same length. If we look at all these attributes, the only one that is different between these 2 quadrilaterals is the length of the sides. When we have a shape and we are going to cover it completely, we have to make sure there is no overlap. For example, here we have a rectangle and I want to cover it with pieces of paper. I would place this paper and then the next paper. But we notice that there is an overlap. What does that mean? Here we have an overlap. That means that one piece of paper is on top of the other. They're not next to each other touching, but one is on top of the other. We also notice that we have a section here that is not covered. It's important that we cover the entire rectangle. So we would have to do the following. We would take one piece of paper and slide it, and then take the other piece of paper and slide it right next to each other. And we notice that there is no overlap and there is no section that is not covered. Partition means to separate something into sections. For example, this rectangle, I could draw lines to go through it, and I will be partitioning into sections. Today, we are going to use squares. Squares are going to be placed on top of the rectangle to partition the rectangle, and we are going to count to see how many squares it takes to cover the rectangle with no overlap. How many same-size squares can cover this rectangle? You're going to be using these squares to cover the rectangle, and we will count them as we place them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 squares cover this rectangle. How many same-size squares can cover this rectangle? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Notice that we have no overlap and we have no spaces that are uncovered. This rectangle has been partitioned into 5 same-sized squares. How many same-sized squares can cover this rectangle? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This rectangle has been partitioned into 8 same-sized squares. In this lesson, you have learned how to partition a rectangle by using same-sized squares.
Okay, boys and girls, now that we have taken a look at how to partition our rectangle using the same size squares and also how to do it with rows and columns, we can now move on to learning how to find the number of same size squares in a rectangle.
How do you find the total number of squares in a rectangle? In this lesson, you will learn how to find the total number of same-size squares in a rectangle by dividing it into rows and columns. We know that it is important that the partition lines for both the rows and columns are the same distance apart in order to have same-size squares. In this rectangle, we have 1, 2 partition lines, so we have 3 equal rows. We also have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 partition lines for the columns, so we have 7 equal columns.
Notice how when she said we have 2 equal lines for the rows, that means we have 3 rows. And when she said we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns, we really have 7 columns. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you always have one less column or row, the line, than you actually have the row or the column.
The rows are the same distance apart, and the columns are exactly the same distance apart as the rows in order to have same size squares throughout our rectangle. The rows and columns have to be equally spaced. Once you have your rectangle partitioned into same-size squares, you can easily find the total number of squares. One way that you can find the total number of squares is by counting each square. So if we count each square in this rectangle, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. There are a total of 15 squares in this rectangle. You can also say there are 3 rows of 5 rather than counting each square. Let's count the squares in this rectangle by counting the squares in each row. Each row has 2 squares, so we can count by 2s to find the total number of squares. So if we count the squares in each row, 2, 4, 6, 8, there are 8 total squares in this rectangle. You can also count the squares by counting the squares in each column. Each row has 3 squares, so we can count by 3s to find the total number of squares. So if we count the squares in each column, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, there are 21 total squares in this rectangle. 7 columns of 3 is 21 total squares. In this lesson, you have learned how to find the total number of same-size squares in a rectangle by dividing it into rows and columns.
All right, and for our last video, partitioning a rectangle into columns. So just columns.
How do you divide a rectangle into equal columns? In this lesson, you will learn how to partition a rectangle into columns by dividing it into equal parts. We know that the word partition has the word part in it and that it means to cut into equal parts. It is often confused how to partition a rectangle into equal parts. The partition lines cannot just be randomly placed on the rectangle. They have to be equally spaced in order for the columns to be equal. When we partition a rectangle into equal columns, the columns are vertical across the rectangle. Vertical is up and down. When a rectangle is divided into equal columns, the partition lines have to be equally spaced. Let's think about what equally spaced means. We know that if 2 or more things are equal, they are the same or same size. And we know that if we are spacing something, that we are placing them a certain distance apart. So equally spaced means that some things are the same distance apart. The partition lines have to be the same distance apart for the columns to be equal. How do we know that a rectangle is divided into equal columns? We have to look at the size of each column. Equal columns have to be the same size. In this lesson, you have learned how to partition a rectangle into columns by dividing it into equal parts.
All right, boys and girls. So those were the 4 videos for you guys today. And I want you guys to head on over to the Google slide for distance learning for math that will be on Google Classroom that looks like this. Okay? And you're going to go ahead and you're going to do your flashcards, and it's going to teach you some vocabulary words. And after you do that, you're going to practice them. So that'll be the learn. I have your math assignment here. I also have an additional video for you guys and an exit ticket. This week's Dream Box will be based on this lesson where you guys will be partitioning rectangles. So head on over there and get started. And if you need me, let me know. Have a great week, guys.